How's it going, guys? Welcome back to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Manny Maradiaga, joining you guys Monday, January 6th. The regular season has come and gone very quickly, I might add, and now it's time to get serious. Now it's one and done. Now all the games truly matter, and now we know who is going to be playing from this point on. The majority of the league is heading home. They're heading on vacation, looking towards the offseason. And now we got the final 14 teams here to look forward to, talk about, and speculate about what's going to go on in this year's playoffs. And a big factor in all of that was last night's game. Talking about Sunday Night Football, we're going to go over what we saw and some specifics about it, right? Jahmyr Gibbs, the Lions defense, which was really impressive, and Sam Darnold as well. Also, there was a lot of things that happened as a result of yesterday's games as well. We had the Tyreek Hill news, which was pretty surprising what he had to say after the game. Speaking about after the game, the Patriots after the game fired their head coach, Jerod Mayo. We're going to get to those two pieces of news on today's show, as well as looking at the playoffs and the schedule upcoming for this upcoming weekend, as well as some other things down the line. So make sure to don't go anywhere and stay tuned for all those segments on today's show. But before we get started, I have to remind you guys, as I always do, if you guys want to get involved with the show with any questions, comments, or just any opinions you'd want to share regarding anything surrounding the NFL, obviously, please don't hesitate to do so. Any input, anything you guys have to say about the show, the NFL, or any topics you want to bring up is always greatly encouraged, and we always appreciate it when you guys are more involved with these live shows as well. So if you want to make it absolutely sure that your message stands out, it gets featured on the show, and that I'm able to see it, there's an easy way to do that now for you guys, just by using the new Super Chat feature. Just by clicking the $ at the bottom of the chat box, it guarantees that I see your message, I can read it out loud, and then take the conversation in a different way, get a different perspective on anything we're talking about as well. So go ahead and let us know what you're thinking. Hit the Super Chat button by clicking the $ at the bottom of the chat box, send in your Super Chat, and get involved with the show. Let me know what's on your mind, and always a big thank you to you guys for getting involved any which way you'd like to. So with that being the case now, we can start off by talking about last night's game, which was a big surprise to me. It was a huge surprise to me because not only did I pick the Vikings to win this game, but the Lions really proved me wrong, especially, but I'm sure a lot of people wrong with how they handled the Minnesota Vikings. Maybe a few people thought the Lions would win, but it's how they won that I think surprised a lot of people, especially, again, myself, who I didn't see a 31-9 victory for Detroit coming in any scenario that I would have ever imagined. So that was one thing, right? And really, the Lions handled Minnesota's high-powered offense in that 31-9 victory, not only to, sweep them this season, but to also get the first-round bye, earn themselves, the NFC North title, and home field advantage, obviously, throughout the entire playoffs. And on the other side of things, it means Minnesota is now the 5th seed. They're going to be playing on the road the entire postseason rather than at home. And it starts this upcoming weekend with the Los Angeles Rams, who, if you guys remember, is one of the 3 teams now that defeated the Vikings as well. So that's going to be an interesting matchup there to see if the Vikings can get over that loss earlier in the season. But, this game for the Vikings was very surprising. Again, it was the lowest points they scored all season, 9 total points. The second lowest they scored this season was a 12-7 victory over the Jacksonville Jaguars, and I thought that was just a one-off. I thought that was their one really bad game that they were going to have. But clearly I was wrong. They waited until the most important game to unfortunately put up the lowest amount of points they had all season. So I'm sure they're going to be disappointed with that, but also not only as a team did they put up their worst performance, but Sam Darnold put up, statistically one of his worst games, if not the worst game of his career with the Minnesota Vikings. He was only able to throw for 166 yards, no touchdowns, no interceptions, and elsewhere, Justin Jefferson only had 3 receptions on 9 targets, 54 yards. Jordan Addison only had 1 reception on 6 targets, and TJ Hawkinson only had 9 yards on 2 receptions as well. Quite literally nothing was happening for them in any aspect of offense, right? It's not like the running game was completely shut down. It's not like the passing game was only completely shut down. Almost nothing was working for the Minnesota Vikings in last night's game. So they're going to be extremely disappointed with that. But I wanted to go back to our matchups that we mentioned in the preview leading up to this game, because 2 of them were pretty spot on, right? Minnesota's weapons, Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, TJ Hawkinson, all those guys going up against a Detroit secondary that just really were handed the business from the San Francisco 49ers, right? The 49ers had no problem going up and down that field with Ricky Pearsall and George Kittle, basically. And I thought that Minnesota would have their way with them again. I thought they'd have more weapons. Their offense is very intricate and very efficient. I thought that they were going to have at least the same level of success, but clearly, I'm going to get to it. Detroit did a lot of good things, not only in the secondary, but overall as a defense. And the second matchup we looked at was Jahmyr Gibbs going up against Blake Cashman. You know, that running back to linebacker matchup. Blake Cashman didn't play in the first game. How would they match up now, and how would his presence affect Jahmyr Gibbs and his performance? Well, it really didn't affect it at all. If anything, you know, Jahmyr Gibbs improved from his last game against the Vikings and pretty much won them this game with how well not only he played, but how much he took over the game, right? I'm going to get to his stats in just a second here, but also the Lions defense, they played like I never would have imagined they would have come out like that with the re-addition of Alexander Zaloni. I thought that they were going to be pretty permeable, quite honestly, to the Vikings' weapons, but huge credit to Aaron Glenn and the entire, personnel of that defense to play like they did last night against one of the most talented offenses in the NFL in such a high-stakes game. It takes a lot. It takes a lot, and it says a lot about their character, the kind of people that they have in there, the scheme and everything like that, the game plan that Aaron Glenn, put into everything. So that was obviously huge. And before I get more into Aaron Glenn, because I want to talk about it a little bit more, this is the kind of performance we were talking about with Jahmyr Gibbs. 139 rushing yards, 4 total touchdowns on the day, 23 carries. He added 31 receiving yards and 5 receptions as well. He was doing it all because elsewhere, for the Lions, Jared Goff had 230 yards. He had 2 interceptions and only 1 touchdown. And Amon-Ra St. Brown led all receivers with 77 receiving yards, and Sam Laporta led them in receptions with 7. But really it was Jahmyr Gibbs doing it all for the Detroit Lions, and in a game where I wouldn't say either offense was really, slinging the ball all over the field, but it was about Jahmyr and running the ball and really controlling the pace of the game. The defense, I thought, was really the overall, star of this game, but Jahmyr was right there with them, controlling the pace of the game, controlling how this offense moved up and down the field, and really just wearing down the Vikings defense was very impressive to see. But going back to the defense, because I think for some part of it, you can kind of expect a pretty complete performance from Jahmyr Gibbs. He had a pretty decent game against them last time, but the secondary and the defense by Aaron Glenn was something I wasn't expecting at all. It was nothing I even planned on talking about, quite honestly, because I thought, the Vikings were going to win. But huge credit to Aaron Glenn. And for anybody that wasn't sure about him being a head coach, or they weren't, certain if he was going to ever, be a legitimate candidate with the Ben Johnsons, with the Mike McCarthys, with the Mike Vrabels of the world, he put out a fantastic tape that really doesn't need anything else said about him, who he is as a coach. All you got to do is look at the game last night and see how he blitzed Minnesota 13 times. He obviously saw how Sam Darnold sometimes has a tendency to hold the ball a little bit too long, so they decided to speed him up, get him off his rhythm, and it led to a lot of bad throws, a lot of missed throws in the red zone, and just really never got the offense going. That was a credit to him. The coverage that he had on guys like Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison and TJ Hawkinson. If you guys looked, a lot of the times, he didn't do it every time, but with Justin Jefferson and Jordan, played very similar but different coverages on each of them. With Justin Jefferson, there was a guy pressing him at the line, and just in case he got beat one-on-one, they had safety help over the top. With Jordan Addison, they weren't really worried so much about the top-end speed per se. They were more worried about the intermediate part of the field, the middle part of the field, obviously, where, the Minnesota Vikings do a lot of their work. And with him, they had a guy, pressing him at the line. They were playing kind of like inside coverage on him. They had a guy lining up on the outside portion of him, and if he ever cut inside, there was another guy waiting, usually a safety, in that middle part of the field. So Sam Darnold really never had anybody to go to in regards to two of his biggest weapons. And Brian Branch and Alex Anzalone, really, for the most part, did a good job just one-on-one with TJ Hawkinson. So I think implementing that strategy was genius by Aaron Glenn. And in the red zone, they held the Vikings to 0 of 4, touchdown to, failed attempts in the red zone. The Vikings only got 4 points in the red zone total, and it was more zone coverage, just passing off players in the back of the end zone. And it was very well run. The game plan by Aaron Glenn was fantastic, and credit to Alex Anzalone, coming back. He had a fantastic game as well. So the Lions did everything perfect pretty much on the day, and that won them the division, that won them the number 1 seed. But, for the Vikings, it sounds like, like the end of the world, right? Because you had all to play for, but you're still in the playoffs. I'm not jumping off the ship, obviously. I still think they're a very good team, but Sam Darnold, people will bring up the old narrative about him not having so much or really any postseason experience and how this was going to be a problem that now kind of resurfaces itself, how he's never been in these situations and how it could hurt the Minnesota Vikings. When they have a good team like this, they just need a good quarterback, but he's never really been in these situations. So it brings up that topic once again, like, is Sam Darnold really cut out for this sort of game, for these sort of stakes and everything like that? And I think it makes for a pretty interesting, conversation. Again, I'm not jumping off of Sam Darnold. I still think, with one bad game, you can't just throw away the entire season. This guy made the Pro Bowl, right? For one bad game, I don't think you just throw all of that away. But it's also interesting, when you talk about the contract extension for him, and a lot of people think he's going to stay in Minnesota. A lot of people think he's earned that big contract. And I'm not saying he doesn't. I'm not saying, putting up 9 points completely strips you of earning a big contract. I think that's the majority of the season, not just one game. But I think this next game in the wild card against the Rams in Los Angeles is going to be a huge, swinging point in that, right? If he goes out there and plays fantastic, everyone's going to kind of forget about this game. But if he drops a dud, and it also depends how they lose, right? If they, only score like 14 points and lose to Rams again, that'll be pretty concerning. But if it's a high-scoring game and then they lose in the end, it's not going to look as bad, but I think that's one thing that people will really hold on to in regards to Sam Darnold and talking about that contract and staying in Minnesota overall. But, that's really where we're going now with the Vikings and the Detroit Lions, both still some of the best teams in the NFC, and now one of them is going to be playing this upcoming week, and the other one earned themselves a break at least until the divisional round of the playoffs. But for right now, in regards to the show, we're going to go from one end of the spectrum to the other, talking about the New England Patriots and their decision to fire now their ex-head coach, Jerod Mayo. Was it the right choice? What are the connections to this firing and Mike Vrabel potentially being a target for them at the head coaching position? We're going to discuss all of that after we return after this break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I
wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit, I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant, I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Jumping back into the action now on the show, not looking ahead to all the teams that are going to continue to play in the postseason, but looking at one of them that unfortunately will have to only look towards the NFL drafts. I guess not unfortunately in some respects, but regardless of that, we're going to talk about the Patriots, right? They didn't waste any time. They didn't waste any time yesterday to pivot their organization in a completely new direction with a new leader set to take that spot, the head coaching spot, in 2025. Their owner, Robert Kraft, made it official after their victory yesterday over the Buffalo Bills, how the Patriots were going to move on from their rookie head coach, Jerod Mayo. They announced that they were firing him in only his first season as the head coach. In only that 1 year, Jerod Mayo finished with a 4-13 record, a point differential of minus 128, which is the fifth worst in the NFL up until this date. And really the decision comes at the end of the season where, at the start, it was all great. It was all optimistic. It felt like the Patriots were really, or at least Robert Kraft, the way he was talking about Jerod Mayo, that they were really buying into Jerod and we're really going to trust them with this project, with this new version of the New England Patriots, right? Like Jerod was the successor to Bill Belichick. Who better than a former player to continue the Patriot way, right? And Robert Kraft, praised him pretty highly during the preseason, I want to say, when he mentioned how he was fully behind Jerod Mayo, how he was thinking about hiring him ever since like 2019 or something like that. And for him to make a decision like this so quickly, as soon as the game ended, I think it was less than 2 hours later where they announced that they were firing Jerod Mayo, doesn't really sit well with me in terms of how this all went down for him. And there's no problem with changing a head coach when the results are pretty bad. And 4-13 isn't great, obviously, and some of the performances weren't great either. It looked pretty ugly at points in the season, but I don't like how so much is being kind of connected to the Patriots just kind of feeling like they just wanted somebody else to be their head coach, not really connecting the results and the performance to how they evaluated Jerod Mayo at the end of the season. It just felt like with all this news coming out about Mike Vrabel now and how he interviewed with the Jets and how a lot of teams are going to be looking at Mike Vrabel to potentially be their new head coach, it felt like the Patriots saw that, heard that, wanted, at least the thought of having Mike Vrabel in as their head coach, felt like they were just kicking Jerod Mayo to the side just for the opportunity to get Mike Vrabel in. Obviously, he has more experience. He's actually been a head coach before, so there's that. But it feels like the performance, the results of Jerod Mayo were, it didn't matter at the end of the day just because Mike Vrabel was going to become available. So whatever Jerod Mayo did, it felt like wasn't important because regardless, they were going to move on from him anyway. And at that point, he was never really given a fair shot. And not that he was set up to lose, but it was always going to be a tall task setting up to be the head coach of the Patriots, especially after the year they had and especially succeeding a guy like Bill Belichick, and for an organization that has pretty much only known success, at least for my entire lifetime, it's hard. It's hard to transition, and people want the results quickly. And there was always going to be a bunch of pressure on Jerod from the fans, from the organization, and things like that, especially, being a rookie head coach. You don't really have a long leash to work with, right? The margin of error isn't that much, but I just like to remind, I guess, a lot of people that maybe felt like this was an okay decision, that, or maybe felt like Jerod and the results kind of warrant him being fired and everything like that. The only thing I would say to that and kind of push back to that would be like, I don't know what people's expectations were for the Patriots going into this year, but I felt like it was a universal thing that after a year that they had last season, that they were going to be really bad this year. I just felt like that was something that everybody knew. I felt like that was part of the process of developing and completely restarting, rebuilding everything. It's hard to go from really bad one year and drafting your franchise quarterback to, I guess, being a playoff team or competing for the division, if that was what some people thought might happen. For a 4-13 record, I mean, to fire Jerod Mayo over that, only that, I think that's a bit far-fetched. I mean, I think Bill Belichick was, like 5-11 his first year or something like that as a head coach, and we're not comparing the two, obviously, but to just say that you fired him just based on record, and for people to say, oh, I mean, look at his record, it was terrible, right? I don't think solely that could be an excuse, and that's where, it builds onto something else, right? It feels like it was kind of premeditated, that the Patriots already had this in mind, like, Mike Vrabel's out there, that's a former guy that we know very well. He could be an even better head coach than Jerod Mayo. He could really speed up the process, right? And it goes back to an even bigger, macro perspective of the NFL and how everybody just wants their first-round rookie quarterback to be the next Patrick or to be the next CJ Stroud or something like that. Everybody wants results from one year to the next. And you can understand it, but most of the times it goes like this. And I just felt like Jerod was hopefully going to be given a better shot than what he obviously got in the end. But I just didn't like how it looked so premeditated, so planned out. Like, Jerod was never going to be given a fair chance, and he was always going to be fired. So at that point, what's the point of, I guess, leading people on, or at least leading Jerod Mayo on? It feels like he was done wrong in this situation. And, no head coach is really going to do great with this roster and the kind of void of talent that they had. Jerod, for him to be 4-13, again, it was to be expected, right? I don't think any head coach, whether it be like Ben Johnson, if he came in this year, or I don't even know, or like Dan Quinn and the kind of success he had with the Commanders and things like that, for first-year head coaches or for new head coaches in new spots to just walk in and take over completely and have like a Washington sort of scenario is, again, far-fetched, and it's not the typical thing that happens. It's what everybody wants to happen, but a 4-13 record like Jerod Mayo had, especially as a rookie head coach, I thought, was all right, and it was at least a stepping stone in the right direction, hopefully, if they would have kept him around. But obviously now they're going to completely shift their focus elsewhere. And also on the news about Jerod Mayo, it doesn't look like, according to reports, that they're going to fire anybody else. So it only really feels like it was going to be Jerod Mayo, maybe some members of the assistant coaching staff potentially, but yeah, I mean, now the Patriots are just going to look forward, and it's not a complete, shift again, right? Because they have Drake May, and they fortunately feel like they have a quarterback like it could be their next franchise guy. So that's a huge step obviously taken, and with the amount of cap space that they have a top 4 pick in this year's draft. It looks like that's going to continue to grow, but now if we're going to shift our focus again to a new head coach, I think right now the favorite probably is Mike Vrabel, with his connections to New England, the success he had there as a player, and, the fact that he was a head coach previously, he has that experience there. It feels like that's the favorite right now for the Patriots. Of course, there's other reports linking them to Ben Johnson and whatnot and guys like that, but I think really Mike Vrabel's the guy that they ideally want to take over this spot. And it's funny and kind of ironic how, it is another former player like Jerod Mayo was, but I don't know. I mean, we'll see if they end up getting him. I'm sure they're going to be linked to a bunch of guys, and the idea of having a franchise quarterback like Drake May and the kind of promise that he showed is going to be very intriguing to a lot of potential head coaching candidates out there, but Mike Vrabel seems to be the guy that has that, that kind of iron fist that the Patriots kind of want running their organization. And again, with the years of experience he has with Robert Kraft and that organization should help him, kind of facilitate that transition into getting his ideas through to his players and whatnot and everything like that. But in terms of, just to wrap it up here with Jerod Mayo and the firing of him, I don't know right now if it's the right choice. I think it's a little early to kind of make that sort of determination on it. It'll all depend a lot on how serious the Patriots are going to be this offseason with the acquisitions and really improving this team, because they need a lot of improvements, and they have the opportunity to go and do it with the cap space that they have and the draft capital that they have as well. So I think once we get through, February at least, and a little bit maybe into March, or at least the end of January here, we'll get a better idea. As soon as, we hear who the next head coaching candidate will be, that'll also be a big step. But until I see, major improvements, I can't see this being any more different than what Jerod Mayo had to work with. And if that ends up to be the case, then I don't think it was the right decision. But if they improve this team a lot and they bring in, say, Mike Vrabel, and they're a lot more competitive, then I'll be more lenient to saying that it was the right choice. If only, again, they take those steps necessary to improve the rest of the team, which unfortunately they weren't able to do with Jerod Mayo. But regardless of that, that's that segment. And we're not only going to talk about, head coaches potentially moving on and being fired and things like that. We're also going to talk about moves regarding some of the highest touted players in the NFL, one of them being Tyreek Hill. And it looks like his time in Miami is coming to an end based on what he had to say after the game, after their loss to the New York Jets yesterday. The Dolphins end up missing the playoffs, and now they could be looking at a future without their star wide receiver. So stay tuned and find out what Tyreek Hill said and what the future holds for the Miami Dolphins when we return.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Jumping back here into the Chip Shot Football Podcast and into another segment that I think it's safe to say that I was not planning on talking about, heading into this past weekend, and all the playoff games and everything like that. I didn't think Tyreek Hill was going to say what he ended up saying after the game against the New York Jets. And this all really started and had to do mainly with the fact that Miami had an opportunity to make the playoffs yesterday if they beat the New York Jets, and the Denver Broncos ended up losing. But obviously, neither of those things happened yesterday, so it doesn't really matter. And for the Dolphins, it's another frustrating year with a lot of injuries, missing the playoffs this year after they made it last season, and just always feeling like they were dealt the short straw, basically, right? Like, it felt like last year they obviously didn't have Tua, so they were hard done by that. This year, again, Tua wasn't there, and there was a lot of injuries and just a lot of bad things that derailed this season, right? It felt like they weren't given the best shot to go out there and compete, because when Tua was out there, they played pretty well, and they had some pretty competitive games all in all. But with the culmination of yesterday and missing the playoffs after a very long and frustrating season, I'd imagine, those frustrations started to boil over with one Tyreek Hill, most of all, because he didn't hold back in his post-game comments about his future in regards to the Dolphins and pretty much where he sees himself in 2025. And I have it up here for you guys to kind of look at it as I also read it, because it was pretty straightforward and pretty direct on what Tyreek Hill is pretty much thinking of doing heading into 2025. He said after the game that this is my first time I haven't been in the playoffs, man, so I just got to do what's best for me and my family. If that's here or wherever the case may be, I'm finna open that door for myself. I'm opening the door. I'm out, bro. It was great playing here, but at the end of the day, I gotta do what's best for my career because I'm too much of a competitor to be just out there. And after, that kind of statement that he made, he was asked pretty directly by one of the reporters if he was just planning on leaving Miami. And you see Tyreek Hill kind of start to have a response, but kind of just shakes his head and just walks away from the question. And he also posted something on X afterwards that I don't have up here, but it pretty much stated the same message that it looks like this is the end for Tyreek Hill and the Miami Dolphins in their relationship. And the response came after also. I wasn't aware of it during the game, but afterwards there were some reports that came out that apparently Tyreek kind of took himself out of the game in the fourth quarter, probably because of those frustrations and just pretty much being done with this season as a whole. And he wasn't out there for the last couple of drives, which many speculated that had to do with this entire situation, how he was just checked out and just essentially quitting on his team. And I don't like saying it like that, but it's hard to kind of pivot away from it or not direct it in that direction, because when you don't go out there, and I know the season's rough and it looks like you're not going to be playing, but the last thing probably any NFL player, any team guy should really do is, have that sort of image follow him, right? You don't want to just kind of say, forget about these guys. I'm done with this team. It's not working out for me, so I'm done with this game. I'm just not going to play, right? And you don't want that sort of image or message following you, but it's hard for Tyreek because of what happened at the end of this game, not playing, and also saying something like this afterwards. In hindsight, obviously, I think that he should have cooled off a little bit and maybe not said or be this direct after the game, because after the game, obviously the emotions and the tensions are running high, right? After the season, after you come to that realization on the field how you're not going to be playing in the postseason, and like he said, for the first time in his career, that must be like super, like an unimaginable frustration, right? Because this is your first time not playing into, January and whatnot. So that's obviously one thing. And I think in hindsight, the most reasonable thing should have been like, give one-word answers, give no responses, just be very bland with the media, but don't kind of all like just air it out like this, just like 20 minutes, 30 minutes after the game ended, because you're never going to think the responses through. You're never going to really think about the repercussions it could bring and everything like that. So I think in hindsight, probably should have held off on that and maybe said it like on X would have been fine, or on a podcast or something afterwards. I think all of that would have been better than pretty much saying to reporters in the locker room as well, where I'm sure other teammates and everybody else could hear him basically say that he's leaving, that giving an emotional response like this was definitely not the way to go. But again, in a sense where I don't want to defend him, but it has been a pretty rough year for Tyreek Hill. He failed to exceed 1,000 yards. He finished with 959, when in his first 2 years he exceeded 1,700. And, he's only just gotten there, and there was always the idea that him getting there was going to push Miami over the edge. But that's where the conversation kind of enters a new realm, per se. And, you talk about the situation with Tyreek and how we even got here and why all of this kind of starting to boil over now, I think makes Tyreek Hill look even worse. And this kind of response makes Tyreek Hill look even worse than, maybe not saying anything or just having it play out in a different way, right? A situation like this was never really going to benefit Tyreek Hill, and I think this just rather hurt him than, maybe increase his chances of, trying to be traded elsewhere or just be accepted anywhere elsewhere, because he's going to be sought after, right? Just because he is Tyreek, he has otherworldly talents, right? You know, the speed and everything like that. But, I mean, in a scenario where it all played out in the most ironic way because you have a reason to be upset if you're Tyreek, right? Because things haven't gone your way. But it's not at the fault of, you know, like, Dolphins are just bad, like, I'm not getting any help or anything like that. Tyreek knew the kind of situation that he was heading into when he signed for Miami, right? And not only when he signed for Miami, but when he made the decision to know that he was leaving Patrick Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs, right? When you make a decision like that, it obviously has to do with the money, because you're not going to find another situation better than having arguably the best quarterback ever throw you the football. And, you know, the stats with him in Kansas City are obviously different with him in Miami, especially this year. So making that decision to leave Kansas City and leaving that dynasty, that juggernaut of a team, and choose the money, and, you know, there's no problem with going and getting paid and everything like that. That's fine. That's great for Tyreek. If that's a decision, if you can go out and get more money, go out and do it, right? But you have to know making that decision brings you the possibility that it's probably not going to be better on the other side, right? The grass is probably not going to be greener on the other side because you're leaving in such an ideal scenario that you can't even imagine it being even better than that. And he tried to play it out like that when he talked about Tua and kind of hyped him up a little bit as being more accurate than Patrick and really trying to be, you know, positive and upbeat about it. Again, no problems with that. But when things start to go bad, when you might not make the playoffs or you're not winning the division each and every year like you are in Kansas City, you can't go back and kind of whine about it and say something like this, right? Like, the Dolphins are what's the problem, or like this whole situation just wasn't what you thought it could be, when you knew when you signed for the money that it could be a possibility that it could end up being like this, right? So you can't lash out when you get your money and things aren't going your way and still, you know, decide to go this route because you knew it was going to be a possibility. So it's a weird situation because it's so fresh after the season, right? It's not like we're in February or anything like that, right? It's the day after, and he said something like this. So I think we're at a point of no return now. I don't think that you can, as the Miami Dolphins, and Mike McDaniels was pretty, I think, reserved about it after the game, where he kind of gave out a message like he wants players that want to be here to be on this team, right? And he didn't address it too directly, but it didn't look like obviously he was too thrilled about what happened or this whole situation going forward. So in the end, I think Tyreek will probably just end up getting what he wants and being traded, because there's no benefit really in forcing him to stay. If he's already said something like this, and even if he comes out and apologizes or anything like that, I think that bridge is pretty much burned. I don't think you come back from saying something like this and just saying pretty much that you're going to leave right after the game, and the fact that you didn't even finish the game also isn't something you could just come back from just like that, because now your teammates have it in their heads like this guy just left in the fourth quarter. What's going to stop him from doing it again, right? So, I mean, it is tough because he is under contract for the next 2 years. He has a $27.7 cap hit in 2025 and a $51.9 million cap hit in 2026. So there's got to be a little bit of that and a little bit of negotiating with that as well. But in overall, just this whole situation is just really not a good look on Tyreek. I think definitely overall it could have been handled better. He could have approached this better. I always think it's better to do it behind closed doors, but now that he's aired it out like this, this relationship is only going to end pretty negatively. So we'll see when it does get resolved. You know, I mean, people are still going to want to acquire Tyreek Hill, obviously, right? Like, the Cowboys stand out. Washington stands out. I don't know, a team like the Raiders, the Chargers is also another one, but they don't really have a lot of cap space. I'm just going off of teams that need wide receivers, like the Patriots, obviously. The Arizona Cardinals would be interesting. So there's a bunch of teams out there that would want a talent like him. But again, painting yourself in a light like this won't really help your opportunities to find a new team just like that. But again, when you're talented like that, a lot of things can be overlooked, quite honestly. But we'll see where that takes us. Just another storyline to take us into the offseason, right, for some of these teams. But moving on from the teams that won't be playing into January, we're going to go back to talking about the playoffs. Kind of an overarching look at the playoffs. We're going to be talking about the matchups, the schedule for this upcoming weekend, and maybe some upsets that we could see, in my opinion. So we're going to be talking about that after this upcoming break. Don't go anywhere.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Back here on the Chip Shot Football Podcast for our next segment, going back and talking about the playoffs, the playoff picture upcoming for this upcoming weekend. Obviously, we got the final picture for the playoffs now that it's set after all the results yesterday to determine this final seedings, who's going to be playing who, and what the wild card round will look like this upcoming Saturday, starting on Saturday and ending on Monday. So I have on here on my sheet of paper the seedings 1 through 7 for the AFC and the NFC. Starting on the AFC side of things, we have the Kansas City Chiefs as the number 1. They earned themselves a bye week with a 15-2 record. Then we got the Buffalo Bills at number 2, finishing the year 13-4. The Ravens in at number 3 with a 12-5 record. The Texans with a 10-7 record at number 4. Then the Chargers, with the win over the Raiders and the Steelers losing to the Bengals, they jump to the number 5 spot with an 11-6 record. And the Steelers and the Broncos, both at 10-7. The Steelers get the number 6 seed, and the Broncos finish with the 7th seed in the AFC. On the other side of things, the Lions, with their win last night, they get the number 1 seed, obviously. The Eagles were already locked into the number 2. Then at number 3, the Buccaneers, because they won and the Rams lost yesterday, they get the number 3 seed, despite the fact that them and the Rams are 10-7. The Rams are the number 4 seed in the playoffs, where the Vikings obviously are the number 5 after they lost, and the Commanders, because they won their game yesterday against the Cowboys, they finished the year 12-5 and the number 6 seed, whereas the Packers get the final seed in the playoffs with an 11-6 record. And I thought it was kind of neat how in the AFC, a combined record of 81-38 between all those teams, and in the NFC, a combined record of 86-33, only a 5-game difference there in favor of the NFC. And not to write too much into it, but I think it just kind of hints at the idea that the NFC playoffs are going to be a lot more wide open. I would say, like, all these teams, I think really have a great opportunity to upset anybody on their side of the bracket, right? Whereas the AFC, I think it's a little bit more predetermined between the Chiefs, the Bills, and the Ravens. They're the teams with the most wins in the conference, so I think that is going to be a huge determinant in that, but we'll see. I mean, you never know, but I thought that was pretty interesting. But talking about the schedule now coming up in the wild card, the games are going to begin this upcoming Saturday on January 11th with 2 games on Saturday, both in the AFC, starting with the Houston Texans hosting the Los Angeles Chargers at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time. The Chargers open up as 3-point favorites in that game, leading into the night game at 8 p.m. Eastern Time with the Steelers traveling to Baltimore once again this year for the 3rd game between these two teams in the AFC North. And for any of you guys that didn't know, this is the first time since the 2014-2015 season that the Ravens and the Steelers have met in the wild card round, with the Steelers holding a 3-1 record in the wild card round over the Ravens. But with that being said, this year the Ravens open up as pretty heavy 9.5-point favorites over their division rivals. So that's very heavily leaning towards the home team, and I think most people are going to pick the Ravens to win this game. But regardless of the games on Saturday, we're going to get into them a little bit in just a few seconds. But before I do that, I want to get through the entire schedule. So leading up into Sunday, it starts with a 1 p.m. Eastern time game with the Denver Broncos traveling up to Buffalo to take on the Bills. The Bills, much like the Ravens, are heavy favorites. The Bills open up as 9-point favorites at home as well. That game is followed up by Green Bay at Philadelphia at 4:30 p.m. Eastern time, with the Eagles again opening up as home favorites, 5.5-point favorites over the Packers. The health status of Jordan Love is going to be important in this game, obviously, so we're going to talk about that in just a few seconds. Then the Sunday slate concludes with Sunday Night Football as usual, with a rematch of a Week 1 game that we saw this year, with the Commanders taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers once again at 8 p.m. Eastern time, and the Buccaneers open as 3.5-point favorites in this game. The Commanders and the Buccaneers, obviously, if you guys remember, played in Week 1. We got a decent look at Jaden Daniels a little bit, but obviously from, September to all the way until now, both of these teams have gone through a lot, individually, some of their players and things like that. So I think it's really interesting and fascinating how they're going to be playing again as well. But the entire wild card round concludes on Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern time in another rematch game, as we see Minnesota travel to the Rams again to try and avenge their second loss of the season from Week 7, when they also traveled to Los Angeles and played the Rams, and they lost that game. And now, I didn't write this down, but I'm starting to remember that game a little bit more. And if you guys remember, towards the end of that game, we saw that face mask on Sam Darnold that wasn't called, in the end zone, and that pretty much killed the game right then and there, because I'm pretty sure it was a safety called on that play because they didn't see the face mask, and it ended the game for the Vikings, right? They stripped the Vikings and Sam Darnold of that opportunity to kind of maybe get a game-winning drive or a game-tying drive in during that game. So having these two teams meet again is super intriguing for me, and unlike some of these other games, the Vikings actually open up as favorites on the road, -2 points currently on the ESPN betting sites. So those are all the games in the wild card round, right? And just some quick notes on all of those games that we kind of ran through there, just in terms of scheduling. The first thing that I noticed was there's going to be 4 rematches in these games, with the Steelers taking on the Ravens again. I mentioned the Bucs and the Commanders, the Rams and the Minnesota Vikings, and the Eagles and the Green Bay Packers as well. So I think that's great. Sometimes people want to see new matchups or anything like that, but I think with football especially, because there's no series or anything like that, and you only really play outer division opponents like once, obviously during the season, because it's such a short year, it's more intriguing, I think, when you see somebody once again. And I think that's what intrigues you so much about the divisional games like Steelers, Ravens, Eagles, like Cowboys and things like that, right? That's what makes it more interesting, when you have the opportunity to really show your dominance over one team, or if you're on the losing end the first time around, you have the opportunity to kind of get your revenge. So I think having rematches in the playoffs is awesome. How either team changes and what kind of things they do differently is always such an interesting chess match for me. So I'm really looking forward to those games specifically. But going back to the Chargers game against the Houston Texans, that's one of them that's going to kick off things on Saturday. The Chargers open up as road favorites, and I think they should be favored, honestly, by a little bit more. I think, they were favored by, why can't I see it? Oh, I see. They open up as 3-point favorites, and I think that might be a little bit too low. I might have had them as like 6 or 5-point favorites to me, because, the Chargers are one of the hottest teams going into these playoffs, and the Texans, I know they won yesterday, but they really haven't been, compared to some of these other teams, like the Broncos, like the Eagles, like the Vikings, and even the Commanders and things like that, they're on a little bit more of a roll, right? They've kind of piled up some really impressive games over the course of the last couple weeks, whereas the Texans really haven't shown that. They've kind of been there, haven't been there. They've showed you the talent that they could have, but the majority of the season I feel like has been just kind of like it's been all right. Like, they won the division. The AFC South wasn't really that great, whereas the Chargers, they're in a tougher division, obviously, with how good the Broncos are now, and the Chiefs, obviously, there's not much to say there. For them to, play the Chiefs very close in both games, to sweep the Broncos, to play a lot of teams close with Jim Harbaugh, and this being his first year, and how he's turned that defense around, how Justin Herbert looks great, how they got a stud wide receiver in Ladd McConkey. I think I'm feeling more positive about them going into this game than the Texans that, they just beat the Titans, but they only just scored 2 points against the Baltimore Ravens. They only scored 10 points against the Chiefs, and it hasn't been so inspiring. So the Chargers, considering what I've seen from them, and, the fact that they got themselves into the 5th spot in the playoffs, and, over the course of these last couple weeks, they've played some pretty inspiring football, beating the Raiders, give that what you will, destroying the Patriots as they probably should have, beating the Broncos, they got smacked by the Buccaneers, but regardless of that, I think they're just playing better. They have more of a positive aura going into this game, so I like them to get the victory there, just as my initial feeling for these games. I'm not getting my hopes up for the Steelers game because I saw something today where, just quickly on the Steelers, how like they should want Baltimore. They know Baltimore very well. They should want to play Baltimore. Baltimore should not want to play the Steelers because they match them up so well. Like, they're arguably one of the worst teams, and I've seen a lot of rankings that have the Steelers as the worst team heading into the playoffs because they obviously lost their last 4 games, and going up against the Eagles, the Chiefs, and the Ravens again, those were the games where you could have proven yourself, but to head into the playoffs now, knowing that you haven't won a playoff game since, 2017 or something like that, to lose out the last 4 games, I don't know what you could tell me about this team that makes you think that they're just going to go into Baltimore and give them a hard time. From what you've seen from Baltimore especially, I'm not going to get my hopes up over this. Maybe the Ravens play a little bit closer against the Steelers, and you got to wait to see how Zay Flowers is, but I just think the Ravens, for them to lose this game would be catastrophic, so I can't see them doing that, so we're not going to get too much into that. The Ravens are heavy favorites for a reason. Then, moving into the next game, Jordan Love's health will be something to watch. He was being monitored during the game against the Chicago Bears. He came out, then he had a possibility of going back in. So, obviously, having a health issue going into Philadelphia playing against that defense isn't ideal, especially when their defense can produce a lot of pressure like Minnesota did against the Packers just a couple weeks ago, and how uncomfortable that made the Packers for the majority of that game. So that'll be something to keep an eye on, just as a little, note here going into this segment. Also revealed today was that Christian Watson, unfortunately, tore his ACL, so they're not even going to have Christian Watson for this game, unfortunately. So that's something to keep an eye on in this game as well. Then, moving into the last couple games here, the Broncos, they're a great number 7 seed. I think realistically they could be higher based on how, if you compare them to the Steelers with the same record, a lot of people probably feel better about the Broncos than they do the Steelers. So that is something that I've seen a lot of people mention as the Broncos could be a potential upset watch over the Buffalo Bills, but I don't really buy it too much. I'm not overly giddy, I guess you could say, about the Broncos' chances in Buffalo, mainly because, for a rookie quarterback to go into Buffalo, a place where the Bills haven't lost at all this year, and to keep up with the potential MVP, I know their defense is great. I know having a guy like Pat Surtain is awesome. Nick Bonito is awesome. What I think their other pass rusher's name is something Cooper. I don't want to call him Bradley Cooper if that's not his name. But, he's been awesome. Riley Moss has been great for them. So they got a lot of players on that defensive side of the ball. They lead the league in sacks with 62. And I think it's going to be a complicated matchup, but I'm not going to say that I expect it to be like an upset kind of watch game, because I think that's a tall task to ask for Bo Nix, regardless of how awesome he's been. Again, I just don't buy it yet. I think the Bills at home are a lot better, a lot more. They don't beat themselves at home, basically. So, I think, what was the favorite line? I think they're -9. I think that's about accurate. They could play them close, but in the end, I think the Bills will just pull away. Then the last two games here, looking at Tampa Bay and Washington. It was a 17-point win for the Buccaneers in Week 1, but from that point on, Washington and Jaden Daniels have just skyrocketed into a whole new status of contendership, I think, and they're not to be taken lightly. We're going to see Mike Evans against Marshawn Lattimore again, which should be exciting, as it always is. And we got two of the best quarterbacks in the NFC. We have one of them that made the Pro Bowl, and another one in Baker Mayfield that probably feels like he should have made the Pro Bowl. So I think this game's really going to come down to both of those guys doing whatever they can to get a win in this game, because so much got the Buccaneers over the line and won them that game, and we saw Jaden Daniels win against the Falcons and against the Philadelphia Eagles. So that's going to be a great quarterback matchup in that game overall. And then lastly, just a quick note on the Rams and Vikings game. The Rams offense looked like it was too much, like it overwhelmed the Vikings in their last meeting. So I want to see how the Vikings not only respond to that, but just respond to getting beat up by the Detroit Lions. Are they just going to tuck their tail between their legs and just get kicked out of the playoffs? Or is that defense going to step up? Is Stafford, going to step up and produce a better performance, especially going up against Matthew Stafford with all the playoff experience he has compared to Sam Darnold not really having any? That's a few things that I'm looking out for in these games. I'm obviously going to talk more about them as we go through the week, but that's what we have coming up this upcoming weekend in the first round of the playoffs. But a last segment here before we conclude today's show has to do with the playoffs and has to do with the Lions wide receiver Amon-Ra St. Brown making some pretty interesting comments last week about the seedings in the NFL and how he wants to see some of them change, maybe going forward in his mind. And I thought it was interesting, so we're going to end the show on it, and I'll let you guys know what he said after we return after this break. Thank you guys for joining me here on the last segment of today's show. And for today's last segment, I thought I'd bring up a topic of discussion that I saw last week ahead of the Vikings and Lions game. Amon-Ra St. Brown, he has his own podcast and everything like that. He brought up the idea that, obviously the Vikings or the Lions, one of them was going to end up playing on the road and being a 14-win team. To be on the road the entire playoffs was something that didn't sit right with him, right? And we now know, obviously, that the Lions won the game and got the number 1 seed, and the Vikings lost, and now they're going to have the 5th seed and have to play all their games on the road in a season that is arguably one of the best, if not the best, in their franchise's history. They set a mark like that, and they don't really, get a reward for that, unfortunately, because of how the playoffs are set right now in the NFL. And the idea of 4-2 teams, facing off with everything on the line, but only one of them would have to play on the road the entire postseason, despite, a fantastic record, was something that, again, like I said before, wasn't sitting well with Amon-Ra St. Brown. And I thought the comments that he made were pretty interesting, knowing what we know now, and how, not that it's going to change the playoffs or anything like that, but it does open up a topic of conversation that you could really get involved in if you really think about really making changes to the playoffs and things like that. But this is what Amon-Ra had to say last week, ahead of their game against the Vikings. He said on the playoff seedings, he said, "It's crazy. I think the rule should be changed. Obviously, if you win the division, you should obviously make a playoff spot. But having a 14-win team having to go on the road is kind of crazy, but I guess I don't make the rules. Hopefully, we can get a win and get home field advantage, but whatever happens, we both have a spot in the playoffs, so we might see each other after this game." And St. Brown also made the point about how a break, like we know the Lions have now because of that bye week, would help them because of all the injuries that they have, to Alexander Zaloni coming back, and we saw how huge that was, obviously. And with a bye week, I'm sure David Montgomery is going to play in the divisional round now, knowing that he has a week off, along with the rest of the team and anybody else that could be potentially on the brink of coming back, right? I mean, guys like Malcolm Rodriguez, like Barnes, those guys I don't think have a short-term injury to come back from, but, really David Montgomery's the biggest one that could return for them for the majority of the playoffs, and if they get to the Super Bowl, maybe we could see Aiden Hutchinson again, right? But that's still a long ways away. But St. Brown also wanted to reassure that he had confidence in the Lions as a team to go on the road and win, considering the fact that they're undefeated on the road as well. But now, knowing what we do, obviously, they're not going to have to go on the road. All their games are going to be at home, which is fine by them, I'm sure. So I thought the idea of him bringing up the changing to the playoffs, it was a little bit interesting, because first I wanted to agree with him, because having a 14-win team on the road, for you to go the entire year, especially now that the season's longer, it's more wear and tear on your body and things like that, for you to get 14 wins is nowhere near like just a little thing that you did, right? That's a huge, huge accomplishment. So because of all that hard work and everything like that, you feel like you've earned the right to have like more come your way over some other teams that maybe are 10 wins, 11, 9 wins or something like that, right? You feel like entitled to more of a reward for having the season that you did, especially over, division winners that, like I said, might have 9 wins, might have 10 wins or something like that. You feel like you deserve more than maybe those teams have, right? But based on how the division is set up right now, I think really changing it to what I think, Amon-Ra's kind of alluding to is just the best records get buys, or the best records kind of have more of a home field advantage than teams with just worse records, kind of bypassing the divisions and everything like that. I think doing something like that would be going a bit too far, because then we get into this rabbit hole of like endless possibilities that you could enter when talking about the playoffs and how everything's seeded and things like that and who plays who, right? You can get into talking about how is it just the best 4 records, get home field advantage, or maybe you extend that to a fifth team getting, one home playoff game, and maybe you have 2 wild card teams instead of 3. But then if you do that, right, Amon-Ra St. Brown said one of the things that he wants to keep is that all division winners get a home game, right? They should have an automatic spot. But if you keep it like that and still want to go along the route that the best record should get rewarded, then you could go, like I said, to maybe 5 teams get a home playoff game, and maybe only you have 2 wild card teams to still keep it at 7. That could be something you do, right? If you change to also the best 4 records, right? If we completely negate the divisions and just say, you know what, the best 4 records in the conference get the top 4 highest seeds, right? If you don't want to do 5 and 2 wild card teams, if you just want to keep it a 4 and 3 wild card teams, and just say the best 4 records get a home playoff game, then I feel like the significance of the division goes away, almost like the NBA. I really couldn't tell you who's in each division in the NBA, right? I don't know who's in the Celtics division. I don't know who's in the Warriors division. I know they have divisions, but it doesn't really matter because it's all just based on the best records in the conference, right? Nobody really pays too much attention to that, right? If you just won the division, it's just like, all right, like, great. Like, you just still need a better record than some of these other teams to have a better seeding in the playoffs, right? And I don't think that's something the NFL really wants to explore so much, right? Like, even into college football a little bit, where a big problem in college football, just kind of like as a side note here, is the conference winners and how much value goes into that right now with the 12-team playoffs, right? Do you really benefit from a bye week if you win your conference? And if some people think that you don't, then they take value away from winning the conference championship, and that's something you don't want to do at all, obviously, right? If you're college football, you want there to be value in winning the Big Ten and winning the Big 12, winning the SEC, right? You want to feel like that means something, and I think the same goes for the divisions here. You still want to make it seem like it's important, right? And with that comes like the rivalries that everybody wants to see, right? The rivalries with the Steelers and the Ravens, the Eagles and the Cowboys, the Packers and the Bears, the Lions and the Bears, and things like that. You want that to have value, right? But if you take this idea, right, then maybe the top 4 records get the home playoff games, right? Because, they've earned it. They're a 14-win team, a 13-win team, right? They should have a home playoff game over a division winner that might have 10 wins, right? But because their division's bad, they get a higher seed, and that might not seem fair to some people. So you might say that, all right, if the top 4 records just get the home playoff game, then in order for that to be accurate, you can't play like these home and away games against certain teams. You might say that they can still play, right? But playing those teams twice in a system where you want the best 4 teams to have the best 4 seeds, you can't play the same 3 teams twice and have it kind of like you did with the divisions and kind of like you do now with the 4 best records getting the best 4 seeds, because it's not accurate at that point, right? If you're going to have the 4 best teams have the 4 highest seeds, you're going to have to spread it out a little bit more. You can't play home and away against the same 3 teams. And if you do that and really go into that route, you take away from the rivalries, right? You're not going to get the Ravens playing in Pittsburgh and then knowing later that you're going to have to go into Baltimore if you're the Steelers, right? And playing those teams twice, where you kind of lose a little bit of that nostalgia. And, for old time, football fans, right? I think that's something that never wants to be changed, right? So that's what would come with an idea that, the best 4 records would have to play a much larger field of games, because if you don't, then you don't really know who's the top 4 teams if you play 3 teams home and away just to kind of keep that same divisional feeling, right? If you know what I mean. So you got 17 games right now, so you can't have, 6 of them being against the same 3 teams, right? That's also something that has to be taken into account. So I think there's a lot of things that could be changing. There's a lot of things already changing with the amount of games and the international games and things like that. I don't know if this is something to, really change and kind of mess around with, because yeah, it is a little bit annoying that the Vikings are going to have to play on the road, because I'm sure they feel like they're better than the Rams, that they're better than the Buccaneers or things like that, right? But I mean, you're not always going to get 2 teams in the same division having 14 plus wins, right? This has been a pretty much an anomaly kind of season, right? The way that it kind of played out. It'd be great if they were always, competitive like this, right? But it always feels like one team's going to be done wrong, right, in a sense, right? Because they don't get a home playoff game based on all the hard work they did to get 13, 14 wins, right? So that's a little bit of a downside of it, but also Amon-Ra said too that they're great on the road, and really to just kind of tie it up in this kind of final statement, right? He said that they're great on the road, so honestly, if you've won 14 games throughout this season, and in the Lions' case, if you're undefeated on the road as well, you're going to be okay as a wild card team, right? Honestly, like, what are we talking about? We're talking about a 14-win team in that same breath where I just kind of laid out everything in their favor, obviously, but if you won that many games and you got to play a few road games, 3 of them, to kind of get to the Super Bowl, it's not the end of the world, right? You won 14 games. You think you could win 3 of them to get to the Super Bowl. Again, it's not ideal, but we're not talking about like a 10-win, 9-win team that has to play on the road, right? That's a little unlikely. But if you won 14 games, you could win 3 on the road and get to the Super Bowl, right? If not, then you're kind of like a fraudulent team in that sense, right? In my opinion. So both of these teams are going to be all right, in my opinion. It is a little bit dicey, though, in that same breath, because you're playing the Rams on the road if you're the Vikings and you already lost there. But, again, they're more than good enough to beat the Rams. They've proven it throughout the entire season. They're a 14-win team for a reason. They should be able to go out there and have all the confidence in the world to beat maybe the Rams, beat Detroit again on the road if they have to, and then maybe beat the Eagles on the road if they have to. They're capable of doing that. They have the talent. They have the resume to do it. We'll see if they could actually go out and perform like they can this upcoming weekend. So that's still a long ways away. We got the whole week to talk about other things. But for right now, I want to thank you guys for joining me on today's show. We're back to the regular scheduling, the every weekday live shows, and then obviously none on the weekends. So thank you guys again for joining me. Please remember to like, follow, and subscribe to the Chip Shot Football Podcast, as well as following the network on all forms of social media. And if you want to see more of the Chip Shot Football Podcast, check out both YouTube channels, the Sports Network channel and the GSMC Podcast Network channel, for more content around the NFL with me, Manny Maradiaga, as your host, talking about all the games, breaking them down, talking about all the latest news in and around the NFL as well. All of that is up on YouTube for you guys to go enjoy. But for right now, we're going to sign off, and we'll be back again tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time for some more discussion and fallout from the playoffs, as well as looking ahead to the weekend.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit.